Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Lee, for coming out tonight. My name is Lee Marsden. Together with Professor John Charmley, we've just launching a religious literacy network at the university. And this is the first event in that particular series. There'll be a series of 3 lectures, talks, with the support of the Keswick Hall Trust. So these are Keswick Hall Trust lectures. We're particularly grateful for their support. In particular, we've got Danny Mash and Aaqil Green here. Thank you very much for coming. We'd just like to acknowledge your support. And what we're going to do tonight is have a conversation, hopefully leading to debate, between our 3 guests. We're going to ask our visiting professor, Hon Charles Clarke, to introduce our guests in just a moment. But we are particularly pleased to have the nation's favourite conservative, Sayeeda, and Aaqil Ahmed here tonight. And I'll hand over now to Charles to introduce them.
Thank you very much, Lee. As you say, this is the first of a series designed to try and encourage more debate and understanding about the place of faith in our national life, in our politics, in a variety of other ways. Often a very controversial field, but our 2 guests this evening are particularly well equipped to help kick us off. Baroness Warsi, in the cabinet, the Conservative cabinet no less, played a key role as Minister for Faith with a wide range of other responsibilities, but she developed her reputation as being outspoken and clear about the need for Britain to put faith in our national life in the right place. And I'm going to start in just a second by asking her a number of questions for 10 or 15 minutes about what took her down this path and how she was able to do that. Aaqil Ahmed played a not entirely dissimilar role in the BBC. He was head of religious broadcasting for the BBC after a long career. And of course the BBC isn't the most flexible of organisations, and I'm sure Aaqil had a number of interesting contretemps during his period there to try and promote an appropriate version of how you dealt with faith in our national broadcasting system. So what I'm going to do is ask first Sayeeda and then Aaqil for about 10 or 15 minutes to talk about their own lives, and I'll ask questions and take it forward. Then I'll ask them just the key question to conclude that process, which is what the steps they think are the important steps to take in developing faith in our national life in this country. And then after they've answered those, we'll throw it open to you for comment and discussion as widely as you want. So Sayeeda, extraordinary really, the political role you've played, both for your party and for the country. In the cabinet, playing a leading role. Obviously you had your controversies within that area, but can we just kick off with your own personal life? How did it come about that you ended up in the House of Lords and a member of the Conservative Liberal cabinet of the last Parliament? Can you just take us through your personal history?
Quick potted history. Well, I was born in a Yorkshire mill town in 1971. I'm 44. The second of 5 girls. Dad was a typical immigrant from Pakistan, came to work in the rag mills. When I was born, things were looking up. He became a bus conductor. And so progress had happened. And I would say a typical kind of working class stroke, traditional Muslim upbringing. Went to university, studied law, qualified as a solicitor. Was always involved in political campaigns. In fact, Aaqil and I were at college together many years ago. I don't know how they let him cross the border from Lancashire to Yorkshire, but they did. But he came across the border to learn. We taught him well.
And I took you to London to was it the demonstration against Grants Not Loans?
Grants Not Loans. We were on the Grants Not Loans demo together. I just hope those photos never appear. And then went on to get quite heavily involved in racial justice work, spent 6 years volunteering with the Joseph Rowntree Trust. And really, I mean, if we look back to my university days, to use a term that's oft used now, radicalisation, what radicalised me and my generation was the colour of our skin. It didn't matter what colour you were, but we identified ourselves as black.
Excuse me, as your faith, rather than your faith. It was
Rather
the colour
than
of your
your
skin
faith.
rather than your faith.
Absolutely, it was the colour of your skin. We identified ourselves as black people. It didn't matter whether you were black, brown, Asian, whatever, gay, lesbian, it was black. That was the big, race was the kind of defining feature. And if you looked around the world, really in terms of what was happening both in the US, South Africa, the riots that we had here, that was what was the kind of defining feature that made you the other. And things started to change over time, and I think for me the kind of real moment was September the 11th. It really allowed me to stop and think about what it meant to be, as I used to refer to myself, as Asian and British or black and British. And I suddenly realised then that I wasn't Asian and British, I was actually Muslim and British. And I wasn't really sure whether I wanted to fight those battles all over again, really. And so I was running my own legal practice at the time. I sold it, I packed my bags, picked up my little one, and had an early midlife crisis by leaving Britain for about a year. I went back to the villages where my parents had set off from in the 50s and 60s.
In Pakistan.
In Pakistan. Ended up getting involved in lots of charitable work, travelled the length and breadth of the country, went to Abbottabad where they eventually found Osama bin Laden. But I assure you and my Conservative colleagues I was not being radicalised. That was not where my year's worth of sleeper cell training was happening. And then came back in 2003, was at Conservative Party conference, had been involved in Conservative
I was going
Party
to say,
local
why did you
politics.
choose the Conservatives rather than Labour? You were brought up in a very Labour area, and that may be the reason, of course. But what drove you down that particular side? Because there was a moment with you as a Conservative cabinet minister, as opposed to any other cabinet minister. That it is itself a question giving rise to a story. So could you just tell us why it was you chose the Conservatives?
I have a long-standing joke actually with Neil Kinnock. I say to him, do you realise I met you as a teenager and then obviously decided I was going to be Conservative? And we have this banter across the House of Lords regularly. My father voted Labour most of his life. My mum voted Margaret Thatcher, I think, rather than Conservative. She voted for this strong kind of woman, and that was what she felt she wanted us to grow up to be like. And for me, I think certainly in my 20s was when I, rightly or wrongly, for me the party of aspiration was the Conservative Party.
And aspiration was the word which took
Aspiration was the word for me. It didn't matter where you were born, actually you could be anything you wanted. Whereas I felt the message I was getting, certainly locally from the Labour Party, was you've been brought in a pretty bad way, you've been born into a pretty bad lot, and things will be tough for you, and we'll try and make it a little bit better, but it's unlikely you're ever going to go beyond that. Whereas I felt the message that I was getting from the Conservative Party was, it doesn't really matter where you're born. Actually, with the right opportunities, you can become anything you want. So for me, it was a party of aspiration. And I believed in a bigger society, smaller state, low tax economy. I mean, ultimately, in terms of my own beliefs, I fundamentally found myself at the right, centre-right of politics.
And so you were at the 2003 Conservative Party conference.
And I was being opinionated, unusually. And one Oliver Letwin was Shadow Home Secretary. And he came over and probably talent spotted is the only way you can define it, and said, would you think about standing? And I said I would consider it, but I would only stand in my hometown. So I put my hat in the ring for Dewsbury. I was selected. I fought the seat in 2004-05. I didn't win. We reduced your majority by half. I knew we'd take it the next time round. We did. We took it back this time. And fought that election, and during that election ended up meeting Michael Howard, got involved in the national campaign, and he introduced me to a young man who he thought I should work alongside, called David Cameron. And that young man then put his hat in the ring for leadership. I was part of his the team. I introduced him when he did his big speech in Blackpool, and the rest is kind of public history.
So he then appointed you to the Lords, appointed you to the government. Did you enjoy your period in government? I know it ended a little bit fractiously, but Did you enjoy it? Did you feel happy in it?
You know, government's a bit like childbirth. You kind of, it's really painful at the time, but afterwards you only remember the good bits. And then sometimes you're so stupid you want to do it all over again. You do actually at the time, government is tough, you know that. It's long hours, it's hard work, it's a thankless task. I mean, politics is tough. It's a pretty awful, God-forsaken, soulless world most of the time. We're talking about God here today. There's very little God and very little soul and very little of what people of faith would see as a really important principle sometimes in politics. The rules of the game seem to be very different. But would I do it all over again? Absolutely. But what the comfort that I have is that the time in government didn't stop me from being me, because I used to say this to myself all the time, and I'm glad I can still say this, that long after government has come and gone, I want to be able to look in the mirror and be able to live with myself, and I still feel that I can do that. You
had the job of trying to define, in a way, what being Minister for Faith was, and of course that wasn't simply being Minister for the Muslim faith, it was being Minister for all faiths, the place of faith in our national life. Can you just talk a little bit about how you addressed that role or that problem of what were you about, what were you trying to do?
It was a job that I created with the Prime Minister. It was a job that I specifically asked for, and it was a role that we created. It hadn't existed before, and sadly it doesn't exist now. For me, I wanted to really look at the way in which I fundamentally believe that faith has been an informer of the debate for so many of the challenges that we face in society for hundreds of years, thousands of years. And I felt that we were starting to enter a phase where faith was no longer an informer of the debate, but not only was it no longer an informer of the debate, if there ever was a point when it considered itself to be at the public table to be an informer of the debate, it was shouted down. So one of the things that I was regularly called in that job was the Minister for Fairies, Goblins and Imaginary Friends. And it was this sense of, actually, I think the last Archbishop of Canterbury put it really well, where he said, religion is seen as the preserve of foreigners, minorities and oddities. And I kind of thought, okay, I fit all those three categories, I should really do this job. And in a way, because I am Muslim, and the majority of the work that we were doing predominantly was around the Christian faith and the role of Christianity, the Christian heritage of Britain, Christian identity within Europe, I think I felt much more comfortable in that space than, say, one of my colleagues who was Christian by faith. And I would have colleagues who are practicing Christians who would say, it's much easier for you to do this, actually, because if we were doing this, we would probably find the space much more hostile. So I felt that I needed to make the case for faith, and faith as an informer of the debate, and faith and an understanding of faith, and look at those areas where faith can be part of the solution.
I'm going to pause there. Thank you very much, Sayeeda, for that biographical and very informative history. I'm now going to turn to Aaqil Ahmed and ask the same kind of question. Just the main point of introduction I want to make to Aaqil is he has had to deal with all the kinds of decisions within the BBC about how you deal with religious broadcasting, how it's covered. If you think of whether, Thought for the Day in the morning through to big feature programmes, Aaqil has been at the centre of those decisions for a long period of time. And I'd really like to start, Aaqil, again. What took you in this direction? Tell us a bit about you. We know it's Lancashire, and always, Yorkshire is different to Lancashire, shall we say?
Better, not different.
Can you just begin with your own personal history in the way that Sayeeda did, and how you started?
Very similar in many ways. I mean, my dad drove here from Pakistan.
Yeah.
But he was at university in Pakistan before he got married. So he came in. My mother was a child refugee in partition. So those two big things kind of had a real impact on us. One, my mum's
In
fear.
1946.
In 47, yeah.
47.
So she was a refugee in 47. So that has a big impact on you later on. You don't realise it at the time, but later on you realise a lot of things about your worry about whether or not you're ever going to be safe in one place may come from the fact that your mum's always saying to you, don't get into trouble, they'll throw us out of the country.
Yeah.
And my brother's our reaction would be, well, they're going to throw us back to Wigan where we were born. But I now realise where that came from. So yeah, I again, number 4 of 5 kids, and my eldest sister was a doctor, and she's a doctor in Norwich, and she's not here, thank God. So if you know a Dr. Nazir Ahmed, that's my sister. Because of that, I went to art school. I had this real thing. I studied politics. I was studying history and politics at A level, and I probably would have gone on to do PPE or law or something of that nature. But I really wanted to be a graphic designer. I wanted to design albums for that shows how old I am, albums for the Clash and the Jam. But so I went to art school, and my dad that in the mid-80s, if you can imagine 1985, a young Pakistani guy going up to his dad and saying, I want to go to art school and design art record covers. But I think his attitude probably was, I've got a doctor, it's fine, he can go off. So I did it, and because I'd studied history and politics, I had that very big interest and was very politically active in that time in the mid-80s, and we had everything in them from the miners' strike going up.
Were you still living in Wigan at that point?
Still living in Bolton. We were actually in Bolton at that point. And family had their own business, so we worked on them. So there was a whole kind of working in the business, studying, which me and my brothers did. And it's going to sound really weird now to a lot of people, but I studied graphic design in an era before computers. So once, I remember in the last week at college, after 2 years, somebody introduced us to an Apple Macintosh, and we all realised we just wasted 2 years of our life. So I then went off, I worked and studied in Dewsbury, where I didn't actually know I'd met Sayeeda until years later, but I met Sayeeda there. I spent a year learning about computer-aided design. That was what I was doing. And that got me into film, and then ended up doing a degree in film, and then the first Gulf War happened, and that had a huge impact on the kind of programs I was making. And I ended up, after I graduated, having spent a lot of time working while I was still a student, I ended up at the BBC. And so I worked in Asian programming for a little while, and on Panorama and programs of that nature, and I left after about 5 years once I'd become a producer, and in that time I'd made a program about, I did an investigation into corruption in the halal meat industry, which changed how we know that there was no such thing as a halal meat industry until that day, no such thing as a halal meat authority, etc. And also did an investigation into alleged vote rigging in Labour Party selection of candidates, which had an impact on the net.
It wasn't alleged, was it? It was true.
I was true. I was trying to be polite, but it was true. Yes. And that led to the changes in the system, which eventually gave us the first Muslim MPs, because it was, as you remember, the seats that they closed down were all in what we would then call Asian seats, but became what we would now know as Muslim Asian seats. Left the BBC, went back to the BBC. So I worked in the BBC until around about 2000. The BBC decided to do a big season on Islam. And I was in current affairs, that was my job. I was current affairs series producer at that point. And so I was made the executive producer of this big season.
Sorry, just to interrupt. During this current affairs phase, you weren't specifically doing films about
no, not at all. No.
Occasional ones that came up.
Just occasionally. I spent most of my time actually as a crime specialist. I don't think anybody could imagine there'd be a working class Pakistani boy from Manchester would be either a police officer or a journalist undercover. So I was undercover turning over lots of bad people. That's what I did for a living, as well as make general kind of investigative programming. And I was also one of the people who worked on the funeral of Princess Diana and produced Turkish earthquake coverage, etc. So I did lots of events. So I think when they decided to do a big moment on Islam, I think the feeling was he's probably one of the most senior Muslims we've got in the BBC, and he works in current affairs, and the things that he's done, he's probably not going to mess it up. So that's why I did that, and I did that for a little while, thinking I would go back to current affairs, and in fact, started to work at the latter part of this big season on Islam. Started to work on my next project, which was a series on life in the northern mill towns, which became a series called Trouble Up North, which in fact all the mill towns we chose ended up having riots and disturbances that summer. But 2 weeks after I spent 11 months doing this Islam season. 2 weeks after it had gone out, And we'd had everything from a home front special on Islamic art and design through to a Jules Holland special on music, the first documentary on the Hajj, and you name it. We had a whole series of programs. 9/11 happened. So once 9/11 happened, you know, all that work we'd done to try and normalise Islam within Britain, or British Islam, had kind of like been wasted. And a deal was done in the BBC between Current Affairs and Religion to show me for about 6 months. So I did that. And then eventually I ended up working as the deputy editor of documentaries in religion and editing Everyman for a little while my boss was ill. So I did all that for a couple of years and thoroughly enjoyed it, but always had this thing, I'll probably go back to Current Affairs because that's really my first love. But because the world had changed and religious programming had to change with it, they probably needed people with these different kind of skill base. And then out of nowhere I got an invitation to, I was approached by Channel 4, went to Channel 4 and I became the commissioning editor of religion at Channel 4. I spent 6 years there, and in the last couple of years I was there, I was also the head of multicultural programming. And at Channel 4 we did some incredible programming on religion, some seminal stuff such as the first ever interviews with failed Palestinian suicide bombers inside the mind of a suicide bomber. You're probably going to see a pattern in this now. We had a Emmy-nominated series called The Cult of the Suicide Bomber. We had a Oscar-nominated documentary on called Jesus Camp about an evangelical Christian kids camp, as you have in America. We won a BAFTA for Saving Africa's Witch Children, which is a program about the people who are accused of being young children who were accused of witchcraft. So all of that was great. I absolutely loved it. Channel 4 was a great place to work. And then again, got that call that says, the BBC, they've amalgamated the head of religion with the commissioning editor side, and we'd like, would you be interested in coming back? And we'd been beating them basically, and I just thought, the ego in me thought, I want to go back and do that. And also it meant I could go to Manchester a couple of days a week as well, where I grew up. So I took that job on about 6.5 years ago, and when I got the job, one of my colleagues at Channel 4 said, well, you're part of the establishment now, but I didn't really quite get what he meant until all hell broke loose. And there was lots of complaints, lots of how dare this must... I mean, I think the snappiest title I've ever seen, better than Gotcha, was why Aaqil Ahmed should not be the head of religion and ethics at the BBC, which I think kind of like didn't mess around. And there were lots of campaigns. I think you even phoned me at once, didn't you, to say to me, we've sorted out some unionist MP who was very disrespectful about my appointments as well, and it just went on.
Just explain to people, what was the essence of the campaigning? What was the criticism of it? It wasn't your filmmaking techniques,
No,
was
well, some of them dressed it up as, well, he's not very good, which I thought was a bit rich, considering I don't know anybody else in the world of religion who'd won a BAFTA and all those other nominations. But the other side of it was... he's only got, I think in the Daily Mail they said he's only got this job because he's a Muslim, and I think a lot of the campaigning from evangelical groups and from right-wing groups, bodies, was that, of course, why don't they understand this is a Christian nation, etc., and how dare the BBC do it? And that was a real eye-opener for me, because even though I'd spent 10 years at the BBC before I'd gone to Channel 4, maybe those 6 years at Channel 4 I'd forgotten about the goldfish bowl that you can be in when you're at the BBC. But what it also showed me was, even if people themselves, and the people writing some of this stuff, they weren't very, I don't even know if they're practicing Christians, but I doubt it. But the people writing this stuff, they weren't writing it because they genuinely were outraged. I think they were writing it because this said something about how society had changed, and they weren't necessarily happy with how society had changed. And so there was a huge campaign, and it's not gone away. The campaign and the articles to still exist. I'm often referred to as, the Muslim head of religion, and I'm not a Muslim head of religion. I'm a head of religion, and I've never even talked about what my faith is, but people just presume it. And if they really want to give me a hard time, they won't put a photograph in of me, and they'll call me bearded Muslim. It's not a big beard, is it? But I know what they want. I really know what they want the image to be.
The same question really that I asked Sayeeda in a different way. How you've got this new job, they've been brought together, they'd come and headhunted you and brought you back. You had this controversy going on around you that you had to deal with. How did you deal with it? How did you try and create the job of head of religious broadcasting in the BBC in this climate? Yeah. And how did you see your role and what you could do to make it work?
Well, they made me apply for the job and then left me hanging for about 3 months, even though they'd phoned me up. But I had to make that job work because it had never existed before. And one of the things was to give them a bit of a strategy as to what we would do. And one of the key things for me was, I've actually just written a new strategy, the first ever real proper 5-year, 10-year plan for the Director General and how religion across the whole of the BBC will work in digital age that we're in. But initially, when I first went back, I did give them a bit of a strategy, even though they didn't really ask for one, which was to say we have to make programmes that, you know, our audience will like. We also have to start making programmes which you don't throw around the schedule and treat as badly as, you know, Sayeeda was describing how the role of faith is treated within politics. And so you want them to be in the heart of the schedule, which is what we did at Channel 4. And ultimately, we have to think about how will people access this kind of information later. So I was talking about religious literacy, but not using that phrase with my colleagues then, because they wouldn't have understood it. And even I hadn't heard it at that point. I only heard it a few years ago. And what I was saying was, look, there's a lack of knowledge about religion, and at the moment we can make programs that people can watch, but we also have to, I believe, make programs for how people will access this information later on. So how we articulate it today is, you know, 6 years ago when I came back, you could do that about Christianity. You could take people on a learning journey about, here are the programs we've made about Christianity, which will teach you the basics and fundamentals and belief structure of Christianity. Now, 6 years on, we can do that about Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Judaism, Islam, etc. We've even got programs about Nowruz, the Zoroastrian and Persian festival. We've done a program about Chinese New Year. We've got programs now about all sorts of aspects of faith, and also about humanist approaches to death and weddings, etc. So we can do all of that. And my belief is that the programs we're making today, they've got to help with that understanding for the audience. They've got to celebrate and mark and question faith. But ultimately, you know, we've got to have programs which people can then access later on when they'll go on digital learning journeys and say, I'm interested in Christianity. And then they can go online, which is what will probably happen, or even better, at some point, we will give it to them. That's the way my BBC and all those things are working. With metadata, we will be able to say to you, you know, you've been clicking on these things. Well, that shows me that you may be interested in learning about Judaism, for the sake of argument. Here's this series we made. Here's some snippets from Simon Sharma's History of the or Story of the Jews. Or actually, here's a film which we're making right now on the why French Jewish people are leaving, and in fact some are coming to this country as well. Here's a story about modern day anti-Semitism, or here's a story about the last baby born in a concentration camp, or here's a story about forgiveness within Judaism. So we can do all of that, and I think what I've tried to do is get us into a position where we are fit for the 21st century, and also, as part of my role, which is not just about program making, it's also about being the head of religion for the BBC. I've spent a lot of time internally working with senior management and colleagues to talk about the changes in demographic patterns and to talk about what that means for our programming. And we all know what the changes are already. We know there are 3 million Muslims, for the sake of, for example. And we know that in certain geographical areas, there are significant numbers of them in pockets. And we also know that the religiosity of young Muslims is as strong, if not stronger, than their parents, in terms of children, this is. And that flies in the face of what normally happens with immigrant groups. Immigrant groups over time tend to become more secular, whereas Muslims are becoming more religious. And there are issues with that we can go into. But what it means for our programming, particularly for our news programming, is what do we have to do then? So if, for instance, if you use Birmingham and the Trojan horse story, you could say that's
a story about what was going on in
the Birmingham schools. Now, you could say that's a few bad apples. But actually, if you then start looking at demographics and saying 25% of Birmingham is Muslim, in certain areas of Birmingham, they're in significant majority. Who are the people that make up that majority, whether they're conservative or non-conservative kind of Muslims, and what kind of
children? You mean conservative with a small c?
With a C. Not a political conservative, but a theological conservative and a cultural conservative. And then if you then factor in that 88% of Muslims in this country, I'm just using Muslims as an example because it's relevant, I think, to explain the point. 88% of Muslims are under the age of 49. And I think about 40-odd% are under the age of 24, 25. Yeah. So effectively, this is a young group. And if we've already established that your young people are more religious than others, as a broadcaster or as a politician, you've got to figure out, originally as an academic, you've got to figure out how then, is the Trojan horse story a one-off and is it a few bad apples, or is this a glimpse of the future in certain geographical areas? And that's the kind of work I'm trying to do alongside the programming.
Absolutely gripping. I really thank you for that as well. Now, we've had two, I found them anyway, extremely gripping accounts of how these two individuals have come to play key roles in our national life in these areas. And I now want to turn to ask each of them really just one question, which is, what do you think that government politics should be doing? And I'll ask Aaqil in a second what he thinks the media broadcasting should be doing to deal with the position of faith in our national life, to get it properly discussed. Both of you have obviously fought all your professional lives to get that happening. What do you think needs to be done now? Put behind you what you've achieved, which is a lot, and just look 5 to 10 years in the future. What do we need to be doing as a society, as politics, as government, Sayeeda, to try and put this in the right place, the debate in the right place? And I emphasise, I'm talking about all faiths and so on, not specifically the Muslim faith, but faith in general. What do you think on that side?
Well, I think there's a whole plethora of commissions and research and bodies that have been set up and polling that's done to assess the level of religiosity and religious practice in Britain. And every year these figures come out, and then we have great debates about how less people are going to church and less people are practicing this, and therefore we're getting less religious. And yet actually I don't think that those studies are ever nuanced enough to say, well, faith actually isn't always about going to church. It isn't always about how many times you actually practice your faith. Actually understanding the role that faith plays in people's lives and at what points it plays a role in their lives. So I think going back from that, I would like to see policymakers more literate about faith. One of the biggest challenges for me, and not because we should all understand each other or because it's for people like me and you it's of interest, but because if you look across every policy area from welfare through to and where, how and when that is provided, through to communities and issues around integration, through to the Home Office and policing and extremism, through to foreign policy and what we're now seeing in Syria and Iraq, there is always a faith element. It is therefore in our interest to develop a level of faith literacy within our system, which is genuinely supported and seen as valuable. There were a number of things that we started back in 2010. So we set up learning groups, online programs, faith lectures where speakers would come in and the civil service would have access to them, a normalization of talking about faith, an advisory group around freedom of religion and belief in the Foreign Office. And I was still shocked. I mean, if you look at foreign policy, for example, how often do you hear the uninformed informed who sits there and says, well, it's all about the Sunni-Shia divide? And then you think, okay, well, let's try and unpick that. How many versions of Shiaism are there? How many versions of Sunnism are there? What is the huge difference between Sunni Islam, say in Saudi Arabia, and Sunni Islam that may exist in Turkey, or Sunni Islam that may exist in Pakistan? And I think that just that having that level of sophisticated understanding. So what I'd like to see, the Prime Minister has definitely moved on this. And it might be small things. So, for example, when we went into government, we used to do Christmas. You'll recall that we used to Number 10 has a big Christmas reception. And I said, yeah, well, that's great. And, we can all do Christmas. But actually, if I was a Christian, I'd actually want Easter. I'd want Number 10 to celebrate Easter, and I'd like you to bring in all the different varieties of churches that there are in this country now, and that we bought simple things like that were bought in. He has a meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Prime Minister will meet the Chief Rabbi, but didn't necessarily always meet the Cardinal or the Archbishop of Westminster. So it was little things consistently saying, look, think about why this matters and think about why we engage and how we should engage. So I think right from the top, a genuine understanding that faith is important, that faith has a role to play in the public sphere and can be an informer of many other in many other ways of the debate, and develop a real level of understanding and literacy, not just for domestic policies but also for foreign policy.
Very, very clear. Aaqil, from your point of view, what do you think are the real things we should be trying to prioritise now?
Well, I think we all have to understand, a little bit, building on a little bit what Sayeeda said, we have to understand the nuances. So when people talk about the Christianity is in decline, well, it's not. You know, traditional Christianity as we know it may be in decline in some form or other. But actually, whether it's through immigration or through or the growth in evangelical Christianity, and that's evangelical with a very small e, not necessarily with a big flashing American e, you know, Christianity isn't actually in decline. But forms of Christianity are more diverse than they may have been 15, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, who knows. So in that sense, religion is... What we have to do is we have to understand in the public space that religion is back. So effectively for many, many decades, and for, you could argue, you know, we've lived in this post-Christian Europe now for virtually a century. In the post-Christian Europe, religion was supposed to be dead. But in the rest of the world, religion wasn't dead. And because of immigration and because of, you know, of the digital technology and the way the world is now, the rest of the world is with us. And so we have to find a way of dealing with what religion means, whether that's through, you know, policy, whether it's in society, through the media. You know, at the moment we have lived in a period where newspapers don't necessarily have the same amount of religious correspondence that they had. You know, we live in a time where broadcasters such as ITV and Channel 4 and Channel 5, etc., have no longer do religion because they don't think it's important. And from a commercial point of view, you can probably understand why, because commercially those broadcasters have changed, and with newspapers things have changed as well. But this is a subject which is all around us, whether it's through the extremity of faith such as, you know, Daesh or someone like that, all the way to having to understand that there are different forms of Christianity in this country, from traditional COV all the way through to some, you know, African a Christianity that comes from Africa, which may be more muscular than we're used to, through to there are these different forms of Islam or different, you know, issues between Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. The level of literacy that exists is non-existent in many quarters. And that was fine before, but it can't go on. So in terms of going forward, I think the revolution that my kids have been part of, which was part of the Blair government started with, in terms of religious education being more interesting and also compulsory, has been fantastic. It's been a fantastic start, and we have to build on that. It's not enough, and I think we now have to do more of the work that Sayeeda was talking about, what she did in the Foreign Office, and what I've tried to do as well a little bit, and we need to emphasise this more, which is we cannot get away from religion, no matter how much we try and think it's spent force. It's clearly not a spent force anymore. And going forward, as more of the world is more religious than we are, and they're living here, or we have to interact with them, or we're dragged into issues which involve religion abroad as well, then to ignore it and to not have something in place in all forms of, in academia, in government, in civil society, in the media, etc., all those institutions have to find a way of dealing with this. And that's what I've been trying to do within the BBC, is actually to try and say we have a moment now. So we talk about what the future is. I don't think we have to panic this very moment, but we have a moment to grasp this now. Because if you just look at demographic profiles that are in front of us, by 2050, and this is without even taking into consideration Syrian or Afghan refugees or any other further conflict in the Middle East or Africa or whatever it may be, demographic profile changes suggest that by 2050, 40% of Britain will be of a migrant background in some form or other, and that could even include people like us who were born in this country, but of that particular background. That's 40%. So what does that tell us? It's not going to, you know, religion's going to be something that we need to understand as this cultural difference. So that's what I'd say. Let's start planning today, because in 10, 15, 20 years' time, it will be too late.
Tremendous. Well, two tremendous conversation starters. I'd just like to add a word on my own account, because I also do work in this field as well, rather to my surprise, as you would probably be able to spot. I'm not a Muslim from Yorkshire or Lancashire. I was my parents were atheists, and I've been an atheist all my life in middle-class bourgeois London. And in fact, I was relatively unengaged until I started working in inner city London in 1970s, where I saw that the people who motivated many of the community activities in the community organisations actually were mostly acting from their faith, and all kinds of faiths, by the way, all kinds of Christianity, all kinds of Judaism, all kinds of Islam, all kinds of Hinduism, and not from a recruiting sergeant point of view, but because they saw it as their mission as through their faith to try and do good in the communities that they were. That's what they were trying to do. And then I became acutely aware, both as Education Secretary and Home Secretary, that the level of thought in British government, and I certainly say this was true of our government, the Labour government, but I think it was true of previous governments as well, and of the civil service and so on, about religion and its importance in those fields, was insufficient. Obviously, in the case of education, it was a very important aspect. And in fact, I co-authored a pamphlet on religion in schools, which was published last year, and which I'm going to talk about at a later lecture in this series. But of course, as Home Secretary, the first thing I did after the 7/7 attacks was to bring together a group of religious leaders to make a statement together in a very public way about the nature of the attacks and the way that society should respond. And people were very, very ready to do that. But after I left office, I became absolutely clear that of the truth of what both Sayeeda and Aaqil have said, that our understanding at all kinds of levels of the importance of religion in our society is simply far below what it needs to be. And so I have a role in a different university of trying to promote discussion and understanding of these questions. It's why I'm so delighted that the Keswick Hall Lectures are going down this path now. I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. So I just want to add to what Sayeeda and Aaqil have said, that getting this level of public understanding of religion and a sense of what it is the mission of our time, for all the reasons that both of them have said. Now, I'm now going to throw it open to you. I'm going to take questions in groups of 3 and then ask Sayeeda and Aaqil to respond. I need to remind you that we are being live streamed. You can see the 2 little cameras here. So be aware as you speak that when people go to the website to look at this conversation later, that what you say is public, as it were. So please be aware of that. And I'm going to ask you to identify who you are and then ask whatever questions you'd like to ask about this whole question. So could you indicate if you'd like to ask questions, please? The gentleman over there, gentleman in the middle here, and third, gentleman just here. And as I say, can you give your name, please?
Don. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My name's Peter Robinson. I'm an ex-soldier, 30 years service, served overseas for 24 years, lived in both Muslim communities, even commanded a Muslim unit, and Buddhist communities, and for that matter, Hindu communities, mainly in the army. What worries me is the ghettoization which is going on, or appears to be going on. Northern Ireland, 1968 to 1990. Between people who were very close, really, but had certain religious differences. If you go to the rest of the British Empire, in Sri Lanka, the old Ceylon, the Tamils and the Sinhalese, one Buddhist, the other, of course, Hindu. In Israel, and remember, we moved out and handed over the mandate in 1948, we have this problem with the Palestinian ghettos there. And this is what, and the Times today, read the Times today about what has been going on in a certain northern town, regrettably in Yorkshire, and I'm a Yorkshireman too, so I do very much regret it. And this is what really worries me.
So your question, Peter, is about ghettoization and how to deal with it.
It is indeed. I want to know what the answer is to that. I realise in a democracy you can't force people to live in certain areas. They must live where they choose. And I realise they will tend to choose the people they already know and their families and so on. Okay. But this is very, very dangerous. Clear. In Northern Ireland, we were on the streets with rifles and bullets and
Peter,
shields.
that's clear. I've got the question. Thank you very much. Gentleman just there.
Hello, my name's Alan Strange. A question, I suppose, principally addressed to someone who's been a minister for faith. The existence of a ministry of faith implies somehow that there is faith and also unfaith. And I suppose I'm curious about where the boundary lines were drawn. Aaqil just mentioned humanism. Does that count as a faith? Charles is an atheist. Is that a faith? Secular materialism. Where are the boundaries such that people might wake up and realize that faith is an issue that is not merely religion? That's the question.
Thank you. Now, that's right, you.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Bache. I'm an environmental science student at UEA. And my question was to Aaqil. In his opening section, he talked about religious youth and how they're becoming less religious. But then he mentioned that Muslim youth are becoming more religious. And I just, what were your thoughts on, do you think, why do you think they're becoming more religious in particular?
Okay. 3 very good questions. Do you want to kick off, Sayeeda, in trying to deal with them?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with Peter's question on ghettoization. I'm actually writing about this at the moment in terms of how what the kind of communities we grew up in and the kind of communities they became. I was born and raised in a place called Savilletown. It's not particularly famous for some great things at the moment, but it was a fantastic place to grow up in. And it would be defined as an area which is probably now 98, 99% Muslim in terms of its demographic makeup. But when I grew up, neighbours on either side were white Christians. And over time, more and more families have grown. They've wanted to live nearer to their families, and then because there's the convenience of the food that they want, the convenience of the mosque that they want, and the convenience then therefore means more and more people move in. And I certainly remember during my teenage years where house prices in that particular area were far higher than the market value of those houses because there was such a great demand for those houses that it pushed prices way above what, say, an average 2-bedroom terrace or a 3-bedroom semi would cost in another part of town. How do we deal with the issue of ghettoization? Instinctively, people will always find people like themselves. I talk about this when it comes to recruitment. People recruit in their own form. That's why we have, more men recruiting men rather than men recruiting women. It's a natural kind of human instinct. Identity politics means you go out and kind of seek people like yourself. And therefore, I'm not sure that we're ever going to be able to stop that. What I think we can change is when people live in ghettos without any choice. So if people live in a certain part of town because they can't afford to live in any other part of town, because they don't have the qualifications or the opportunities or the jobs to be able to give them the income to be able to live in the nicer parts of town. And I can tell you this and it's very anecdotal, I can tell you this from the perspective of a British Asian. The minute British Asians become successful, the first thing they want to do is move out. And the reason they want to move out is because they want to move into the nice areas where they have the good schools, which are invariably in the areas which don't have large BME communities, the nice kind of middle-class suburbs. But there's a challenge to that. Having done that twice, Peter, and each time having received hate mail when I moved into the area, for having moved into the area because they didn't want my type moving into the area. Ghettoization is a two-way thing. People who will not move out because they feel comfortable because of the convenience of where they live, and people when they do move out to new areas, people around them move out. White flight, it's called in some of the northern towns. And so ultimately, unless we get to a point where people won't feel comfortable about moving out and have the opportunity to move out and live in the better parts of town, and those people, when you move into those areas, actually like you living around them, it's going to be fine. Integration, Peter, is a middle-class pastime. There's a social class issue here. I don't have a problem with integration because my nice middle-class white neighbours come to my house, I go to theirs. We have similar kind of houses, same dinner table. We shop at the same supermarket and our kids go to the very same shishi school. We don't have a problem with integration. But actually, if you're stuck in a really naff white working class estate and there isn't much going on, or in a really bad BME area and there isn't many opportunities, integration isn't the top thing on your mind. It's about, you know, making sure there's food on the table and there's a job that can be provided and there's a school that your kids can get into and there's an opportunity for them to move out. So I think if we go back to assessing this issue around the area of social mobility and opportunity, I think over time that's the way in which you start to get people to make.
I'm going to stop you there because I think rather than taking all three from Sayeeda, I think it'd be more sensible now to ask Aaqil just to comment on that same question. Then I'll come back to the other two questions and answer
It's
the
very
comment.
interesting, you know, you talk about Savile Town, because I lived in Savile Town when I was at Dewsbury College in 1988. And I grew up in what can only be best described as a white area. So we were the only Asians in our primary school, you know, when I went to primary school. And when I went to Savile Town, I thought it was fantastic because there was loads of halal food shops. And I had grown up eating vegetarian food my whole life because we couldn't find any, you know, apart from the chippy, you know, there was nothing else we could eat, you know. So I went there and I thought it was amazing. And then, you know, I went to university in London and and it was more mixed, and in Birmingham it was a little bit more mixed. But just like you know, I've bought myself. In fact, I'd live in a bit of a very wealthy Indian Gujarati ghetto now, because I went to North London, and I went there specifically because East African Gujaratis care a lot about their education for their kids, and I wanted my kids to do well, and I wanted them to be dragged up by these East African Gujarati Hindus. Absolutely, that was it. I'm completely honest about that. And so I think when it comes to integration and ghettoization, you know, sometimes you can... I'm not going to deny that there are some people who self-impose the ghetto on them because they're quite happy with not having to assimilate and not having to change their cultural norms. And I think that is the case in certain parts of Britain. But I'm completely with Sayeeda on this. I think for a lot of us, you know, and I take my own family and old friends in this, you want to get on, and by getting on, you often move out. But it is hard when you move out. It's a lot easier to stay in an area where everyone's similar to you. It's really hard when you move out, and you've got to be up for the kind of making new friends and being the only... You know, and when I think about my mum and dad coming to the part of Bolton they came to in 1972, and they'd only been living in the country a few years, and there were no Asians where we lived, and you know we had to drive for miles to get halal food and Asian food, etc. And we were the only kids at school, and they sent us to, even though we could speak English fluently, because we were the Asian kids in school, therefore we had to be bused to a special school. And I think it took my dad quite a long, with a broad northern accent, by the way, my dad, to explain to them, I think if you listen to my kids, you might understand they can speak bloody English. There was that. So there's a lot of that. So I think we've come a long way, is the point.
Could you address Alan's question now on faith and unfaith?
Yeah, who is it who chooses? It's a very good question, isn't it? And I suppose you could argue in a sense that someone like me does get the opportunity to choose a little bit. And that's why I purposely talked about humanism, because if you look at a lot of the programmes, not all, but a lot of the programmes that we make, particularly on Sunday mornings, the big questions, or Sunday Morning Live, or Sunday on Radio 4, etc., and you know, that we include that particular kind of voice. I think it's relevant to the subject matter we're talking about. And when we did things like, you know, when we've done documentary series on, you know, modern approaches to death and to marriage, etc., again, I think it's incredibly relevant. So I think there is an issue about, you know, about in terms of that. Then there's a more negative thing where people might ask me, and this is where it gets difficult because we're live streaming, you know, but people will ask you for advice on other faiths or groups within a particular faith where the majority of that faith may not see them necessarily as being of that faith. And then it gets quite difficult because the liberal in you says, who are we to say what somebody is or isn't? But when you start then going into the theology of that faith, then that's what you can only base that answer on if you're talking about what that is. So I think there is no one particular answer. I think belief and faith means that somebody, even if they don't profess to have a particular kind of religious ideology, but they believe in a particular way of life and a belief structure, then I think you have to incorporate that. But then there is another side to that, which is you have to be very careful about it. We cannot simply say, if someone says that they are something, yet the rest of that particular religious group say that they're not, then we have to think about what does that theology say about that before any kind of decision is made. And that can be quite tough. So I got myself into a bit of trouble at Channel 4 because we talked about the number of Muslims who'd been killed and what does the Quran say about that when we made the film on the Quran, saying that more Muslims have died at the hands of fellow Muslims than from the hands of non-Muslims. And it's that old chestnut of the Sunni Shia split. What does the Quran say about the Sunni Shia split? Not a lot, because the Shia don't exist. You know, I was investigated for that, because of course for some people that's incredibly offensive, because that's the kind of language that's used by Al-Qaeda, which says that you're not really a Muslim, because you don't even exist within the time of the Prophet, you're an offshoot. Now, the fact is, it's chronologically, historically, it's chronologically there in front of us, but still at the same time it is offensive. So I think it's a very difficult subject area that I have to be involved in, but at times I wish I wasn't. Yeah.
Sayeeda, you must have had to address this a lot in your role as Minister for Faith. How do you see it?
The role was actually Minister for Faith and Communities.
Yes.
So it included communities which were not necessarily faith communities. And at the same time, I had the second part of the job was in the Foreign Office, of which a big strand of the work that we did was around freedom of religion and belief. And one of the things that I was quite keen to do, even though the Foreign Office got EBGBs about it, was that when I used to talk about freedom of religion and or belief, I used to say, and let me tell you what I mean by that. So I have all these speeches that I did when I was at the Foreign Office with this same kind of paragraph in it, and it would say, and that means the freedom to have a belief, the freedom to be able to manifest that belief, the freedom to be able to share that belief, the freedom not to have a belief, the freedom to change your belief. And you can imagine the kind of creepies they got when you started talking about things like that. Saudi Arabia contracts kind of came to mind. And so in that sense, it was really important for us to say, if we believe in the concept of freedom of religion and belief, then we need to be quite bold about going into some of those areas which might be considered to be taboo. And on the advisory group, we'd have humanists on the advisory group. There was regular engagement with a whole plethora of activities. I mean, we got into hot water over the Plymouth Brethren. Which was all about, are they extremists? Aren't they extreme? Can they be considered to be charitable? Well, if they don't integrate, talk about ghettoization, integration. Where do we kind of draw the lines when it comes to the Plymouth Brethren? And then Christian groups saying these guys have been accused of all sorts of things in the past, and therefore you can't touch them with a barge pole. And the Plymouth Brethren saying no, this is the. So you can get into some really kind of difficult areas. But I feel that policymakers' jobs are to be as brave as possible and to be as broad as possible. So I would regularly get into hot water in government and still do, because government, for example, around the issue of extremism, has a list of groups and individuals who they consider to be beyond the pale and not to be engaged with because we don't like their views. My kind of view is very clear. Unless somebody's doing something that's illegal, we talk to them. That doesn't mean we agree with them. That doesn't mean we endorse them. But we actually do not shut down lines of communication, because the minute you stop, and I have the same view in foreign policy, I've never known a dispute to be resolved by not talking to the other person. And I've yet to work out a way in which I can convince you of my view without talking to you. So I think policymakers need to be much more brave and front-footed when it comes to engagement and communication and inclusion, and the broadest range that we can possibly have.
Thank you. Lawrence, I'm afraid I can't read my own writing. Can you just remind us what the question was?
Young Muslims becoming more religious.
Sorry, the division between younger people, young Muslims becoming more religious, young people of other faiths becoming less religious.
I don't think I actually said it as simply as that, but in terms of people of faith, you can, if you go to Hillsong or one of these real big evangelical Christian churches, we have 10,000 people on a Sunday. I think the Hillsong take over the Dominion Theatre, so I think they de-rig on a Saturday night, War of the Worlds, and then have four or five services through Sunday, and then re-rig the War of the Worlds for Monday. It's a huge expense, and they can fit in about 10,000 people or 8,000 people on a Sunday. And then you can have, there's Ruach in South London as well, and there's all these other kind of Pentecostal kind of churches. Then you've got the growth of Alpha. I could go on. So all of these things are Christian church. These are all Christian churches, and effectively a lot of young people involved. So I don't think it's simply about young people saying no to other faiths, but saying yes to Islam. No, the bigger question is that this was a Cardiff University study, which basically just asked the question about what normally happens is groups tend to not be as religious. Now, if you ask the question, why are young children from Muslim families who are from a religion, why are they more likely to be religious or more religious than their parents? And I think that's because they have an identity now that is more Muslim than probably would have been before. So if you think of my parents' generation, they came as Pakistanis. In fact, my parents had to become Pakistanis because they were born in India, and then as refugees became Pakistanis later. So they had to become Pakistanis, and they came to Britain, and they were very proud to be British. And then I was born in Britain, and I'm British Asian, really. And then my kids have been born here, and because of what's happened around them in a post 9/11 kind of world, because there's a lot more polarization, because Islam is definitely more of an issue. Put it this way, I didn't have to explain that I was a Muslim. I had to explain to everybody what a Muslim was when I was a child. I don't think you need to do now. They all know what a Muslim is. They may not necessarily know what a Muslim believes in, but they know who Muslims are. My kids, who are teenagers, are British Muslims. And I think that's gone on, and because of the connectivity that we have now with digital technology as well, whereas when I was a teenage person and I was obsessed with what was happening in Nicaragua with a Nicaraguan solidarity campaign, or what was going on with apartheid, or with what the Palestinians in Beirut in those days. We didn't even know about the West Bank. It was all what was going on with the Israeli occupation of Lebanon. It may have taken us ages to find out about that, and it was probably from a left-wing or human rights persuasion that we were interested in those kind of subjects. Whereas now, because of the connectivity digitally, you can find out what's going on in another part of the world, and also you can almost feel like you're part of that. And I think that part of that conversation has meant that Muslims in particular feel that they are now connected to things that were happening around the world, which 20 years ago, 15 years ago, they'd not even heard of. When I was collecting for Medical Aid for Palestine, there were no Muslims involved in Medical Aid for Palestine and all those organisations. They were non-Muslims. Often most people were Jewish involved in the kind of organisations, because who believed in human rights for those people. So now, because of that, I think that digital technology, they feel more Muslim and they feel connected to this. And I think that therefore has gone down to children who believe that also, if they may be living in that ghetto area for the sake of argument, and they may be looking at the fact that they're not doing well in the job market, and they may blame it on the fact that they're a Muslim. And there's evidence to suggest that might even be the case. But ultimately, it may just have been it may just be where they live, and the schooling that they had, and the fact that they may not have the ability to interact in the job market as well as somebody else. But they'll talk. But it may be. But the issues around Islam then get into it. And so people are talking more about Islam, and I think, and they're becoming more religious because of that, because of what's happening all around them. And I think that's the difference between that and other faiths. Other faiths, people are choosing maybe their faith more. I think for young Muslims, it's becoming way more of an identity, and it actually defines who they are far more than it probably does for other young children.
Thank you. Sayeeda, how do you respond to this?
I think if you look at any community, any religious community, the more orthodox part of that community is on the rise. So if you look, for example, I have lots of Jewish friends who are quite concerned, actually, what they would define themselves as probably secular Jews, liberal Jews, who see this huge rise in Orthodox Judaism, larger families. And so in a relatively small community, this is becoming a larger and larger percentage, but very, very different in terms of its social structures and its achievement kind of parameters of the broader Jewish community, from the level of education to the level of employment to the level of success and housing and health indicators and everything. So and if you look at there's also concerns about a rise in religiosity among Sikhs. The turban, for example, which was something that was only ever worn by men when we were growing up, is now something that women are starting to wear, very much kind of following on from the kind of hijab thing. So there's now a whole group of young women growing up taking the turban as an identity and wearing it. So there is an increase in religiosity, in orthodoxy religiosity in all religions. So I don't ever believe these pollings that come back and say, religion is on the decrease, people don't go to church, therefore, people don't attend church. And also the demographics. I mean, it's not just the black churches, but the Eastern European European influx has led to a complete change in terms of, there are people in the Church of England who say that their churches really have been saved because of European migration, because the number of attendees has shot up and the community spirit has come back. But also I think the place of, what I also see is interesting in terms of young people and religion is where more and more of them, and I think it goes back to what Charles said, you know, you discovered faith through social action really, the good work that faith communities do. I mean, why else would you, you know, when street pastors, why would you stand out on a Friday night in the awful rain, and it always rains in Manchester, you know, in the awful rain in Manchester with people throwing up on you when they've had too much to drink at the end of the night, and getting them home safely? What inspires you to do that for no money? Well, you do it because your faith makes you come out on a Friday night and a Saturday night and do that. And I think more and more young people, and I saw this over Christmas actually, which I thought was fascinating. So over Christmas, we Muslims love Christmas actually, because we kind of have a turkey and we do all the other thing, and we fall out with our parents and eat too much and all of that stuff. But we also have loads of time on our hands over Christmas because everything shuts down. We don't have to go to work. And it's one of those great times of the year, isn't it, where everything shuts down. And so you find, and we do have lots of time on our hands, and you know, the weather's pretty awful, so you can't really do anything. So once you've done the Boxing Day sales, you've got this whole week and a half to be able to occupy yourself. And this year, we found so many young Muslims sat at home thinking, what's my kind of role now? And they got into their cars and they went out and helped with the flood relief effort up in the north, in Cumbria, but also out in Yorkshire and York. And there was this fantastic moment. I thought no PR agency ever could have come up with this. There was this fantastic piece on, I think it was BBC or ITV News, where this guy in York had just had his house terribly damaged by these floods, and he was having a pop at the government, and he was saying, oh yeah, bloody government's not been down here, nobody's doing anything for us, nobody cares, the local authorities not down here, how we expected to cope. And he says, and the only people that have been down here is those Muslims from Bradford. And then 3 men with big beards came into the screenshot, and I just thought, classic, you know, those guys are bored at home.
But that guy's now in Raqqa, isn't he?
Come on. So, you know, so in that sense, I think the kind of young Muslims are now finding their faith actually not through the prayer mat, but also hugely through social action. And I think that's a great sign.
I think that's across all faiths.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So more and more people, we are now saying, so young people are not just finding faith, and a more kind of orthodox version of it sometimes, but are actually finding faith through social action.
Great. Those 3 questions generated fantastic response. More questions, please. I'm going to take woman over here. I'm going to take 2 groups. Woman over here, gentleman over there, gentleman here, gentleman here. Those 4, first of all. And then I'm going to the back. I've seen you up there, but I'll do this group first. Can you give your name, please?
Gwyneth Boswell. What about faith schools? Is there not a danger that they are a form of educational ghettoization?
Faith schools. There was a gentleman just...
So I'm not sending an email, I'm right. 21st century, I'm writing your questions down.
No, he's not. He's actually saying, his wife's saying, where are you? Your dinner's getting cold.
Given what's been said about...
Could you just introduce yourself, please?
Sorry, Ian Smith. Given what's been said about the growing importance and diversity of religion in our society, is it time to think seriously of 2 big questions? 1, to disestablish the Church of England, and B, to reintroduce a law on blasphemy.
Okay, gentleman, was it there? Yes, gentleman just here, please, and then gentleman there. Okay, so thank you very much, sir. And
hello, I'm Alex Brown. I'm a member of staff here in the politics department. In 2005-06, a certain Labour Home Secretary introduced a new offence of inciting or stirring up religious hatred. What do you think was the real reason for that new offence? And secondly, do you think that offence got in the way of what Sayeeda called lines of communication?
Okay, 3 good questions again. I am going. We're doing very well, and I think people are being gripped by your answers. But can I ask you both? I will take all 3 together. If you could be relatively brief in your answers, because there are a number of other people wanting to ask questions, and I'd like to do that before we finish at 8. Aaqil, would you like to kick off, please?
Speaking purely personally, in no way attributed to my job in terms of ghettoization of faith schools. I'm not a big fan of faith schools. I have to be honest with you. This is a parent. And I, for a simple reason that I believe that we all have to meet each other. Had I not been that Asian kid at primary school, the guys that I grew up with probably would, I mean, I used to go and play on the council estate, playing football with them in the evening, and they would have never have met someone like me. And I actually coach kids football, so be careful now in case they see. I coach kids football now, and a lot of the kids that I've been coaching for the past 8 or 9 years tend to come from Catholic schools. And they don't really mix with other kids, you know, and they do now because of my son and a few other kids that have come into the football team, so they're going to mix with those people from another background. And so, just purely speaking, as somebody who is an outsider and has been an outsider in many parts of his whole educational and career and job career, we need to mix way more. And the problem I have with faith schools is actually it's very difficult to do that if you spend all the time with each other. And I've got Jewish friends who agree with that as well. And they often, there's a particular private school in London called Haberdashers, and they say, we send our kids there, but actually there's more Jews in there than there are in our local Jewish school as well. So there is that problem. So that's purely a personal view.
Disestablishment of the church and blasphemy?
Yeah, well, you're never going to get ahead of religion at the BBC to talk about disestablishment of the church. I should say, unless, if I start talking about that, I've already handed my resignation. So I think it'd be very difficult for me to talk about that, other than I think just purely, again, from a personal perspective, you know, it's clearly, it's difficult. So if you, obviously, we all know about the act of tolerance and what and the relation, and not just that, but also the relationship that the Church of England has with the state, etc. And so that would make it very difficult. Sometimes right-wing newspapers and right-wing commentators often come out and say, why isn't the church more vocal, or why isn't it? I say, well, that's not the point of the Church of England in many ways as well. So I think it depends on what you want from the Church of England. I think that as I've talked about before, we have now going forward so much diversity within Christianity as well, that you know, that question may be something that becomes a real big point later on. I think right now, I think it'd be I wouldn't see it happening. And I also believe, as a lot of people of a faith other than Christianity, that actually the Church of England speaks up on my behalf as well. And I'd rather have I'd rather have those 26 bishops sat in the church, in the House of Lords, because I believe they're my bishops. And I'm not just saying that politically, I really truly believe that. I've met a lot of them, and what they say and what they believe in general, and the thing that they give to our political discourse, I'm quite happy for them to do that on my behalf as an individual.
Blasphemy?
Blasphemy. Again, speaking purely personally, on the blasphemy front, I don't think we should have the blasphemy law, actually. I believe that there is, I think everything is, I think we should be open to have any conversation about faith, but I think we have to be understanding of what that can mean, though. So just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should. And I use just as brief an example as I can, which is I've spoken to the Danish Union of Journalists. They asked me to go out once and to have a conversation to the conference, and we talked about something quite important, which is, why is it that in some of the programs I've made on Muhammad and the Quran, etc., we've talked about the authenticity of the Quran. Is it being read in the right language, and therefore it has a different meaning? We've talked about whether Mecca existed in the first place or was made up. We've talked about Muhammad, was he the allegations of paedophilia. We've had Muhammad and issues around the slaughtering of Jewish tribes, etc. And they wanted to know why I get awards for this, and as opposed to death threats. And the big thing came down to this. I said, you can be offensive if being offensive is the byproduct of exploring a subject properly. But if you set out to be offensive, then you cannot be surprised when people get offended.
Yeah.
That's not in any way to belittle the deaths of people and the destruction of people's property and business. I don't think that's obviously appalling, and nobody should be attacked for anything that they do. But when you set out to offend, people will be offended, and the vast majority of people, that will be the end of their offence. But within that group, you may find a few idiots who take it too far. So when you set out to offend, people will be offended, and things will come from that. I have offended far greater than other people, but we never set out to offend, and I think people have understood that.
And inciting religious hatred? The legislation.
I'll leave
on
that one to you.
No, I've already got. He should say he wasn't quite open. He's writing a full-scale book on this subject, and I've already been interviewed for it. So he's wanting it's kind of an independent validation of what I did or didn't say that he's looking for. And you don't know what I said, so you can say.
I can't remember. Well, I can't remember now. It's so long ago. But
Let me remind you, 90 days detention.
I know. I'm trying to be very diplomatic about this. I think it may have been well intended.
You're so diplomatic.
I think it may have been well intended, but like all these things, I think it can be used to silence people.
Okay.
Sayeeda.
Faith schools, I have been a huge supporter of faith schools, although like Aaqil, for me the jury is slowly starting to go out because I'm concerned about the level of separation that it creates, and also the level of kind of closed identity that it creates over time. What I'd love to see, my daughter went to a faith school. She went to an Anglican convent faith school, and I specifically chose it because I liked the ethos. So what I would love to see is actually loads of faith schools, but you can't send your kids to the faith that you belong to. Would be a great kind of idea of doing it. So, and I'd also love to see multi-faith faith schools. So I keep kind of harassing the Archbishop of Canterbury about this and saying it'd be so good to open up, say, a Muslim, Jewish, Christian faith school where you have individual worship and you have strong faith, strong three faiths, but you've got multi-faith in the school at whole. So so strong people of faith kind of come together. And that brings me on to the second question, really, in terms of the disestablishment of the church. No, never. And I'll tell you, politicians have this awful habit of saying, I did a speech on this once and you should read it. I did a speech on this once at the Vatican, in which I spoke about the fact that my Islam is stronger because we have an established church. And I see the established church as a bedrock, really, that in a time when we end up with super diversity, which is what we're going to have in the coming years, it will be the bedrock that will hold all of that together. It will be the linchpin around which everything else then can feed in. And I followed that kind of view through into action when in opposition we put together a paper which I called Active Faith. And in government, it became a program called Near Neighbours. Some of you may have heard of it. And we used the existing network of the Church of England and its overall responsibility to all of its parishioners, for which it is responsible, irrespective of their faith, as a way of delivering interfaith social network projects. So I think that a great bedrock which has the opportunity, I think, to sometimes neutralise what could be conflicts between other diverse faiths within Britain. Blasphemy, no, I don't think we should ever have a blasphemy law. We've seen how it's used politically around the world. I've spent many a meeting trying to convince governments to try and get rid of their blasphemy laws. But I go back to what Aaqil said, which is that we seem to kind of get the space between the right to do something but the responsibility not to in this country. We get that balance quite. We do it quite well in Britain, and I think we need to carry on encouraging people to do that and not to go down the European or the US route. But also, I think what we must draw a distinction is I don't believe religion needs to be protected by law. But I fundamentally believe that followers of a faith need to be protected by law. So you don't protect Judaism, but we absolutely fight anti-Semitism. We don't protect Islam, but we absolutely fight Islamophobia. So I think, in what you'll find in Eastern countries, and this is why we have huge rows at the UN about this consistently, in the East they protect the religion, and they don't necessarily protect the followers. In the West, we protect followers. We don't necessarily protect the faith. And I think we need to make sure that we consistently protect followers of different faiths and make sure that they feel equally protected in our country. And the third question, which was about a Home Secretary who introduced this law. I actually, I was obviously part of the whole thing around civil liberties at that time, the whole David Davis stuff when he stepped down, and whether CT legislation was the counter-terrorism legislation going too far. And it is a consistent balance that we're having to strike between security and liberty. what I do think what good I think the legislation has done, which Charles was involved in, was that he over time, sometimes legislation has to be harsher and further ahead than where public opinion is. So for example, if you asked, no, actually, let me rephrase that. If you went to Tory party conference and asked people whether we should bring back hanging, they probably would say yes. And that doesn't mean that public opinion would therefore dictate that we bring back hanging. And we got rid of hanging long before public opinion caught up with us. I mean, it was the same with equal marriage. It was the same with lots of kind of different things. And sometimes by drawing a line in the sand, as we did with domestic violence, as we did with lots of things, society starts to say, well, that's no longer acceptable. Yes, it may have shut down some debate, but I do believe that what it also said was that you couldn't, you can have a debate and a discussion about why people are driven to be radicalised and then commit terrorist offences, but at least we haven't got crazies who now come on television and say lots of people have died in the Twin Towers, and this is why they did it, and it was a glorious act by... I mean, I just think there's certain things which are offensive to the point, and they're not just offensive for us to listen to, and therefore, you know, we should say, should we have a law for that? But what they do is they send out a message to vulnerable minds that it's okay to believe this. And once you start to believe it's okay to believe this, you then go into the phase of, well, it's okay to do this. So I think that...
My only issue, though, is that you can get that anywhere, and if you don't challenge it publicly, if you don't challenge it, then effectively there is no kind of counterbalance to some of the things that they can say. I agree exactly with saying. I don't want those people on my programs, but the fact of the matter is that information you can go and get, and those kids who have been radicalised in their bedrooms, that's where they're getting it, and we don't no longer really have the ability to challenge.
But where I think it went too far was, I think we had that legislation, but what we've done subsequently, and it's, you know, it's my lot that have done it, and so I have to take responsibility for that. We've moved into a territory where we've moved from being an extremist and a violent extremist and having laws to deal with that, to now trying to bring in space for non-violent extremism. I mean, what does non-violent extremism mean, for a start? I mean, it could be anything. Secondly, the way in which the agenda around preventing extremism has worked, and the prevent agenda specifically, I think, has severely started to shut down the space when where these discussions can take place. And I think the statutory basis of prevent now, for example, for universities and schools and hospitals, and you're an optician, and, you know, look into my eyes, can I work out whether you're a terrorist kind of scenario, which we've got into, is a really bad place. Because I think certainly universities, and we argued this consistently in the House of Lords, and it was a shame that it was just before the election, because the Labour Party were practically navel-gazing and kind of not doing much. The Liberal Democrats were petrified they were going to lose the election and therefore weren't doing much, and my lot just had kind of free rein to go mad for a while. And therefore we ended up with this awful legislation which has now led to prevent, you know, really having its tentacles in all aspects of society, where teachers are no longer teachers, you know, academics are no longer academics. Why is it, and I think we end up with a scenario, don't we, where why is it that a, you know, nice middle-class white professor can sit here and have a very intellectual conversation about what may make somebody a suicide bomber, but, you know, Ali with a beard in the Islamic Society, if he has the same conversation, is likely to be referred to a prevent coordinator. You know, let's create those safe spaces where we can have those conversations.
I'm going to make 3 points. Firstly, I agree very much with Sayeeda on the prevent legislation. Lots of people spoke against it in the Lords. I think it was a step too far. Second, just an example on faith schools, which did influence me, I must say, when I was Secretary of State. I had a discussion with the Chief Rabbi in my office about faith schools. And he said, what I want you to remember, he said, Jonathan Sachs it was, I went to a faith school, the Christ College Finchley, as its name implies, a Christian faith school, but he as a Jew became head boy of the school. And his point was the faith school was about defending confidence in faith, belief in faith, respect for faith, and that was a key element of the whole process. And that's just a dimension of the argument to bear in mind. The other thing I want to say is very much agreeing with both Aaqil and Sayeeda. The question of whether you can do something doesn't tell you whether you should do it. After the Danish cartoons issue, which presumably led to the invitation that you got, Aaqil, to go to Denmark, I was very struck that no British mass media reprinted the Danish cartoon. I was very surprised. I thought there were some of our newspapers which I thought might.
We showed them on BBC television.
Yes, but I'm talking about the
Oh,
newspapers.
yeah, that's
the
different, yeah.
newspapers. And I was quite struck that they decided not to do that. Now, I'm very conscious of time. We've about 2 minutes to 8, but I'm also aware I've left a chunk of people out at the back. So what I'm going to do is very quickly take anybody who indicates at the back of the hall, 2, 3, 4 people I've seen, and to ask your questions, and then a very quick response from the two panelists. So yes, you, then you up there, and then you over there. Yeah.
Evening. My name is Julius. I'm a student in UEA. And this evening we've talked about some negative aspects that religion brings to our society. Like all of you, I think, mentioned 9/11, and we've talked about ghettoization. Today, I believe that religion also teaches us some good things, but could we dream about a society or a world where we can be educated to be high-valued, moral, empathic, and compassionate without religion?
Okay. Is religion essential or not to a good world? Gentleman there, that's right. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Aaqil, but also I'd like to hear Sayeeda's comments on this. And I'd first of all like to take issue with you, I'm sorry to say, over your...
Can you just identify yourself, please?
Oh, okay, sorry. My name is John Turner. I used to work at the UEA, but I'm retired now. I wanted to take issue with you of your view that there wasn't a decline in religiosity, particularly in the Christian religion in this country, because I think there is. And the government, the YouGov poll that was 2013, I think, when it asked people the question, do you believe in the biblical record? 26% said no. That's, in my reckoning, that's 74% of people don't have a faith, and 68% of people, those same people, said that religious views didn't play any part in their daily lives. So if that is true, and then my point is, and living as a person with no religion for my whole life, I've been amazed at the influence that the Church of England still has over British politics, and particularly the BBC. And so my question to you, Aaqil, is...
They would disagree, but yeah, go on.
Please. At what point, I mean, will we ever see a person of no religion having an opportunity to say something on your thought for the day?
Okay, gentleman at the back it was.
Hello, my name is Andrew Claydon. I'm a religious studies and philosophy teacher here in Norwich. I find it very difficult to reconcile what you're talking about when the Conservative government consistently has diminished the idea of religious education in schools to the point where it hasn't put it on the EBAC. So I work for an exam board, and they've cut the number of GCSE examiners from about 150 down to 40. And the reason why they don't train any religious studies teachers at this institution is because the Conservative government cut the funding for it. I just wonder how you reconcile the fact that you think people should be talking about it, but then, to my mind, it doesn't seem like you want to put the money in to be able to actually educate people to be religiously literate.
Your point's clear. Thank you very much. Gentleman there, and that's the final one, I'm afraid.
Hi, my name is Sadadan Bhatta, and I'm a natural sciences student here at UEA. My question is to do with David Cameron's recent take on Muslim women in Britain and their need to integrate. Do you think this is a fair statement, and is it a true issue?
Okay. Aaqil, will you go first, and then I'll give Sayeeda the final word. But if you can both be relatively brief, I know they're 4 good questions.
Yeah, I think the first 2 questions you can wrap in, Tatriv. Do you need to be religious to... Does religion need to be in society for society to be good? Is that right? Something along those lines. It's something that's a very difficult one to follow, but well, clearly no. You know, it's up to you as an individual, so you don't necessarily have to be religion. And does society have to be framed around a religious framework for you to be good? Probably not, no. But a lot of the things that we take for granted today, which even if they're not linked to any kind of religious or religion or religious denomination, may have come at some form, but I don't think in any way they may have come from some form of religion in the past, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to follow a religion today to live a good life or for society to be a very good society. And in terms of the second question with regards to, I mean, actually, I didn't actually say that Christianity isn't in decline. What I said was, if traditional Christianity is in decline, but because of immigration and other forms of Christianity, we have a far more diverse Christianity, and it's changing. So that's actually what I said, as opposed to I wasn't, burying my head in the sand and not seeing what's around me. So I definitely think that's the case. Then with regards to thought for the day, well, look, this isn't a decision that I make. So this is a decision that's made by the executive board. We review it every few years, and the position is at this particular moment that it will stay as it is, which is it's a moment for a religious perspective on the news, and it's about 90 seconds or 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, and it is something which the audience is still happy with. It's something which really works, and it'll be reviewed again in a few years' time. And as everything with regards to the world of religion and the media has changed, it's evolved over the years. There was a time when everything was Christian, and it's no longer Christian now. It's moved on, and I think I don't know what the answer to that will be one day going forward, but it will be reviewed again, and that is always going to be the case. I think the third question was
RE.
RE.
It's a criticism of the government in terms of RE in schools, EBAC and so on.
I mean, it feels a bit weird, doesn't it, for RE to be, if we do need to have this kind of knowledge of religious literacy, then we need to obviously then ensure that the provisions of RE are great. Now, my kids' own school is brilliant. It's a state school, but it's brilliant. And I know that often it depends on the school itself as well as to what they want to do. I take on board some of the comments that you've made as well about the government's position. My take on this is purely simply an honest one, which is if I believe that we have to have better religious literacy, and that isn't necessarily to say that we have to have more people who are religious, but we have to understand religious literacy, and often that goes into cultural literacy as well, then it would make sense that you would invest more in that in a school environment. And comparing my own religious studies classes, and we dropped it as soon as we could because it was terrible, compared to, and I'm sorry if any of the teachers 30 odd years later are watching, compared to the religious education my kids have done at GCSE and A-level, I wish I was studying the one they're doing now. So I think we're going in the right direction, and it would be a shame to end that because I think it's important and necessary. And the final question was about women. Well, you look at Sayeeda. I think Sayeeda and yourself are great examples of a well-intentioned maybe comment about English language being maybe handled incorrectly, because quite clearly, my own family and friends and people who are sat here would be a great example of the fact that, I think there are lots of Muslim women who are very good at speaking English. And I don't think this was meant to be a blanket attack on absolutely everybody. But I do think we have to look at a particular aspect, and that is the lack of English being spoken as a first language. And often this is not just necessarily because of women, but also because of men as well who may come to this country with English not as their first language. It means that there are children who are struggling in those families, and then they're struggling when they go to school as well. But that's not just necessarily a Muslim issue. I'm involved in a mentoring organisation, and we have that in certain schools where there are often 40 or 50 languages that are spoken, and people are struggling. And so it's not just a Muslim issue, but I understand where it was coming from. I think it was coming from a point of we have to help people to do better educationally, and a lot of that comes from whether or not they pick up English early enough at an early stage. But I think how it was handled, maybe, I think with hindsight, I bet they wish they could do it all again.
Thank you, Aaqil. Sayeeda, can you have a shot at those last ones, and any final word you'd like?
Very quickly, can we have a values-based system without religion? Absolutely, I think we can, and many people live their life in a very values-driven way without without associating themselves with a religion. I think Aaqil's answer the second question in relation to the decline of Christianity or the polling around it. The third question in relation to religious education, there was a huge debate about this actually in government when these proposals were coming through, and you know, I had my own disagreements with Michael about this. I felt it would have been Michael Gove. I felt it should have been important for it to be part of the EBAC. I think it would have been great for it to have been a compulsory humanities subject at GCSE level. It wasn't felt necessary. It was felt that because it was compulsory up to the age of 14, that most people therefore would have had a good grounding in religious studies. But I think at a time of this kind of super diversity, it would have been a great thing to have a really solid GCSE level qualification in religious studies as a compulsory subject. And interestingly, I think it was during the time when we were having that great moment of leave everything to the schools and give them the freedom to do exactly what they want, when they want, and then Trojan Horse came along with it, oops, we shouldn't have done that. And so, you know, it's kind of what we think is great doesn't necessarily work out in practice. Occasionally we come across these problems and we're like, who did this? So we think we did this. So we have to go back to the drawing board. But we live and learn.
It never happened with learning.
Live and learn. I think in terms of the question about Muslim women, and Muslim women are traditionally submissive and therefore need to learn English, I think was a comment. Two things. One, I mean, if you're a Polish Catholic bloke, why shouldn't you have to learn English? You know, if you're a Bulgarian evangelical Christian woman, why shouldn't you have to learn English? If you're an Indian Sikh, you know, lady, why shouldn't you have to learn English? I absolutely believe in what David said when he said, you know, people should learn to speak English. If you haven't got the language of the country that you've made your home, you're practically excluding yourself from 99% of life here. You can't, you know, you can't handle your own finances. You can't get a decent job. You can't go to the doctors. You can't handle things around your kids' schooling. Where I take real issue with him is where he said Muslim women first should learn English. Why Muslim women? Everybody who can't speak English should learn English. But secondly, because it will help us deal with the issue of radicalization. Now, I mean, I don't know anything about what your mums were like, but you know, my mum didn't even need Urdu, Punjabi or any language to tell me she was with me. She just used to give me the look, and you knew you were in trouble. Muslim women can stop their children from being radicalized without having to speak to them in English. You know, mine was usually a slap around the back of the head. So I just feel that every time we try and, one, I'm sick to death of making policies for Muslims. You know, government kind of feels that if it can wake up Monday morning and create a headline about the Muslim community, it can detract from everything else that we're navel-gazing about at the moment. And I just think that we've got to stop using the Muslim community of this country as a convenient headline sometimes, because we know we'll get a headline out of it. And secondly, every time we talk about British Muslim communities, we use the word extremism and radicalization. And I think the response couldn't have been better when we ended up with Muslim women across the country, in fact across the world, sending out a little message to the Prime Minister saying, you know, an example was, you know, dear Prime Minister, I have 2 PhDs, I have 3 children who have gone on to do X, Y, and Z. I run the local I'm a local Rotarian, but I come home and make chicken masala for my husband. I'm traditionally submissive. And I kind of had my own version of it, which is that, you know, my mum still speaks really pretty, you know, pidgin English, pronounces everything wrong, but, you know, kind of manages and gets by. And I said, you know, my mum's English isn't great. She's been to English classes. She only got so far in terms of improving her English. But, you know, she didn't produce any terrorists or extremists, but she did produce a chartered accountant, a pharmacist, a head of English, a lawyer, and a cabinet minister. I think she did all right.
Well, I think you'll agree we've had a fantastic evening. I'm sorry that it's run on longer than I expected, but I think the reason is because both of you were so compelling from the beginning in the way you both described yourselves and then the way in which you answered the questions which people asked in a very direct and open way. I think we've had a fantastic evening, and I just want to say thank you, and can we all just show our appreciation to Sayeeda and Aaqil for these questions? Very good.